All right, so this is the last panel of the conference, and it's going to be a good one. Now, the title is Who Should Regulate the Space Economy? And when we're talking about space, I'm sure the first thing everyone thinks about is Starlink, SpaceX, Amazon Leo, which named their constellation after what it is, Leo, which is weird. But there's a whole lot more in the space economy. So, for example, to start us off, there's a company called Reflect Orbital that sells sunlight. You'll be able to contract with them so that at night they can make where you are light up, and you can imagine all kinds of uses for that. And I'm not pitching them because I don't know anything about them, but that's just an example of like all the kinds of weird things that could happen in space that might be huge businesses. And one of the things that's interesting about Reflect Orbital is that this summer the FCC authorized their first demonstration satellite, and it licensed the radio, and as I understand it, reviewed the debris plan, and then it said that the reflector's optical effects were outside of the FCC's authority and under the Communications Act, and so one federal agency licensed the radio, and as far as I can tell, nobody else licensed anything else or had anything to do with it. So, is that an example of a system that's working because it was able to do pretty much what it wanted, an entrepreneur was able to do what it wanted without much government, let's say, interference, or is it a problem because this is actually the Death Star starting out, and because it can aim a beam of light at a planet, and nobody, was able to get in the way, right? And so that's kind of one of the things we're going to be talking about. And so I'll introduce the panelists now. Rob McDowell, who chairs the Global Communications Practice at Cooley and served as FCC Commissioner. Jay Schwarz, who until recently was the chief of the FCC Space Bureau, although still is at the FCC currently, which I guess means all his former staff can just ignore him now when he walks by.
Absolutely.
And Clayton Swope, who is Deputy Director of the Aerospace Security Project at CSIS. So since we started with this example, Jay, tell me a little bit about the decision making. Was it an was it a decision that regulation wasn't necessary, or was it just purely an authority question? And sort of, what was the thought process behind that?
Yeah, great. So I think the Reflect decision is going to turn out to be an important one as we think about sort of setting the rules of space going forward here. And I think I'd shared with you that, as we dive into, what does it mean to determine the rules of space going forward, there's sort of 3 steps. It's figuring out, what are our goals? The second would be then, does this need to be regulated? And then sort of the third question is, who's responsible for regulating it? And so the Reflect decision, which I think you described the details fairly well. They want to use this mirror to reflect sunlight, and they were asking for authorization from the FCC for use of the RF to do essentially the telemetry tracking and control of the spacecraft. And so our decision on Reflect, which as you said, we said evaluating the mirror itself is outside our jurisdiction. I think that really tees up kind of going through that 3-step algorithm that I just mentioned. It says we don't have jurisdiction. We looked at the RF, we looked at the orbital debris, we looked at foreign ownership. Those all are rooted in the statute from Congress. But if somebody needs to look at the mirror, then we sort of collectively as a country should ask the question, okay, is this something that needs to be regulated? And if so, then you go to that second question of who's going to be responsible for it. And I think ultimately that's going to be a question for Congress on who would have the jurisdiction for that.
Rob.
Sure. Well, first of all, I want to start. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you all for staying here. We are all that stands between you and some fly fishing or a hike or things like that. But I just want to point out this Friday is Jay Schwartz's last day at the FCC. He is the Buzz Aldrin of the Space Bureau. So he wasn't the first, but he was the second bureau chief. He has done, and Buzz was the second person on the moon, just in case I have to connect the dots for anyone under the age of, done a fabulous job of streamlining, in less than 18 months, of streamlining the processes there, And I don't need to suck up to him anymore, so right, he has no authority over me anymore. So this is all very sincere. And making it much more customer-friendly, much more responsive. At Cooley, we're blessed with a lot of wonderful space tech clients, including Reflect, although they did that themselves. I'm not here to speak, by the way, I should say at the beginning, for any of my clients or Cooley, et cetera. But
although let me add to that. I appreciate that you say that, but we actually do want you to speak for potential new entrants. Right?
yeah, absolutely. No, I'll be talking thematically for sure. But no, don't worry. Yes, thank you. Just needed to disclose all that. So it's an auspicious year. So July 4th marked the 250th anniversary of the United States of America. August 21st will be Jay's last day at the FCC. And then June 28th was the 100th birthday of Mel Brooks. This is auspicious. So, movie producer, writer. So there's Blazing Saddles, History of the World Part 1, Young Frankenstein, or Frankenstein, depending on where you are in the movie. And then, of course, Spaceballs, where the tagline is, "May the Schwarz be with you." So this is a little audience participation. Sorry, Mr. President.
That's awesome.
So as a thank you to Jay, on the count of 3, can we all yell, "May the Schwarz be with you"? Ready? 1, 2, 3. May the Schwarz be with you. Thank you, Jay.
Thanks, Rob.
I didn't know where you were going with that. I thought you were
I
gonna
wasn't
get to a
expecting that.
board with like red twines.
I forgot what the question was.
But well, so
Way to not answer the question.
Yeah, right.
whatever. Right. yeah,
We've all forgotten.
Look over there.
I forgot what the question was. But no, so I mean, when you were, let's take it from Reflect's point of view. When they were trying to get permission, how did they approach this? And then when they came to the question of the mirror, was it, hey, here's something that's not a bottleneck, good for us, or I mean.
Right. So I'm not going to speak directly to that because we actually did not help Reflect with that, although they were incorporated in a Cooley conference room, as I like to say. So it's the idea is to direct sunlight onto, let's say, solar farms at night to generate electricity. Could be for search and rescue, et cetera. And they're very narrow, defined beams. And it's fascinating. I've been to their plant, their factory. So sunlight is optical, and as Jay just kind of pointed out, optical is not regulated by the FCC or anybody else, right? It's light, unregulated light. So that is unregulated right there. So again, and we can talk more about this, but in being an FCC chauvinist and an RF chauvinist, I like to tell my partners throughout Cooley, whether they're emerging company venture capital folks or debt finance or whatever, all of which, intellectual property, all of which the space tech entrepreneurs need, is eventually you have to come to my office because you can't do anything in space without RF. You can't launch the thing, steer the thing, talk to the thing, control the robots that are mining on the moon or whatever it is you're doing. Yes, optical is you can do that with optical, but it's not there yet. And it also has its limitations, has great potential. But in the meantime, you got to go through the FCC to do anything in space. So eventually, they're going to come through our office. But yeah, so look, this is a wonderful entrepreneurial story of a kid from Massachusetts who had this idea, and it's now
Started off with
real.
magnifying glasses on ants and.
Yeah, pretty much. And I think that's right. I think in interviews he said that. And eventually for some types of these business plans, and I don't want to suck up all the oxygen here, so I'll shut up in a second, but whether it's 1 million data centers in space or whatever, we're going to see the evolution of regulation in space, right? So people are going to care about the night sky and all the rest, they'll have a lot of questions. But this is a case of first impression where we're helping people, and Jay was helping people, companies do things that have never been done before in the entire history of the planet Earth, right? And it's an absolutely wonderful time, especially at this stage in my career, to see these business plans coming forward. It's a boom. There'll be a bust. There'll be some restructuring. It's a lot of CapEx, a lot of OpEx. ROI is, questionable still in some cases. But so a lot of credit. It's a great case study. So thank you for raising it for how the Space Bureau did a great job.
Yeah. So maybe what I'll add is
Some stuff is what I'm doing.
So you focused on Reflect, which, as you said, this is one license, sort of case law developing there. But we did this massive modernization of all of our rules. It's called Part 100, and the real goal there was to make the licensing process faster, more predictable, more flexible, to support the space economy, right? And one of the big insights as we were sort of doing the audit of what needed to be improved, particularly to make it faster and make it more predictable, was how do you reduce decisional friction in this process? Because one of the things that became apparent is where there's gray areas in, is that something that the FCC, gets raised in the record? Is that something that the FCC will regulate or do conditions on or so forth? Just creates this massive amount of internal decisional friction. And so one of the key things we did in this modernization order, which was adopted by the commission in July, is we actually articulated what, for reviewing these space station applications, what were the bounds of the public interest review. So you have public interest, very broad, and then we identified 4 areas, each of them rooted in the statute, of addressing harmful interference, efficient use of the spectrum, orbital debris, and then foreign ownership. So you can link all of those to the statute, and we said that's what we're going to look at. And I think as we head into this future world where people are going to want to do things like mirrors or potentially contaminate celestial bodies, or you could go down the list of all these sort of things that don't cleanly fall into any of those 4 categories. We think that actually by making it clear what we will review and what we won't review kind of shines that light, no pun intended, on the areas that might need review by someone or maybe don't. And so we really view both what we did in the modernization and in Reflect as teeing up that conversation more broadly, which I think ultimately leads to us figuring out as a country how to do these things so that there can be greater predictability for these entrepreneurs that are trying to do more innovative things.
And actually, that's a perfect place to bring in Clayton, because in our email, our conversations, what should we talk about? Clayton made the point that, before you ask who should regulate, the question should be, what's our objective? What is it we want to be doing in the first place? And everyone pretty much agreed with that. But of course, I hadn't asked it, and that means I have the whole wrong title for the panel. But really, Clayton, I mean, what is it that we should be trying to do? What is that first question, and how do we answer it?
Yeah, Scott, I think we've all been saying, too, there's just so many things that companies want to do in space. I think we do gravitate towards broadband and connectivity as the main use case. And I think we do that because that's the first commercial satellite. It was Telstar in 1962. Broadband, I guess you could say. It was communications. That's the one part of the space economy that's independent of having the government as a customer. So if there was no government entity buying something from space, we'd still have broadband from space. But all these other things, humans in space, on commercial space stations, as tourists, in space manufacturing of semiconductors or pharmaceuticals, beaming sunlight, mining on the moon, servicing satellites in space, all of these things really right now, they're dependent on the government as a customer. So I think these things we kind of think separately in our head than what we see as the main driver of the space economy, which is broadband and independent of the government customer. So I think we gravitate towards that, and we think of spectrum use in all of these applications, but in particular, broadband. So just all of these things, though, a lot of different activities in the in Space Force terms, this is a whole operational domain. So just think of all the things that could happen in the sea domain or the air domain, and that's the diversity of things happening in space. So that's just kind of a prelude for me to say, well, what should we be regulating? I think that's a question that I struggle with, and I think of what is regulated now in space. So maybe I'll just say that really quick. So we've talked about spectrum. The FCC role there. The FAA has jurisdiction over the national airspace, so this is essentially launch, and then reentry. There are companies who are doing reentry. So FAA has jurisdiction over that, and they look at the rocket and then the payload, but it's really just to look at how that affects the airspace. And then the third one to think about is commerce, and that's through commercial remote sensing. So this is satellites that are taking pictures of Earth. So you think of Planet, for example, and you see a lot of imagery in the news that comes from companies who are selling images. So those are kind of the 3 areas right now that you see regulation. We've talked about FCC. So FAA, we're really looking at safety, national security of the airspace. When it comes to remote sensing, we're mostly looking at national security. So for all these other activities, the question really is, well, what is the outcome we're trying to achieve or prevent or encourage if we apply regulation to space? And at least for the last 10 years, there kind of have been a trend within the space community, within government, to say, we just need to have a way to, I'll say it this way, regulate space. It's called mission authorization, is what you might hear it. But it's just kind of a framework that I guess you could say the policymaking community has said, we need this for space, and it's mostly to honor, they say, obligations through the Aerospace Treaty of 1967. But this is a very broad mandate to just regulate space. So I think, Scott, to your point, I'll go back to just the question is, what is the outcome we're trying to achieve? And if you can't really think of what that is, I don't know how you're going to come up with good regulation.
Can I add to that real quick? Which is exactly. I think so. The illustration here is they're new facts that regulators in Congress, et cetera, have not been able to think of. Right? These are entrepreneurs who are brilliant and are trying interesting things. And startups, entrepreneurs don't think like regulatory lawyers, nor should they. God bless them. Right?
Thank you.
Exactly. And so I have one client who shall remain nameless who launched a few years ago an experimental object to go around the Earth. And you need FAA authorization, so this is a little vignette, to launch things, all right? So that makes sense. You don't want to hit an airplane. You can't just start launching rockets. You need FAA authorization. And their thing was going to go around the Earth for a few days while they experimented with it and then bring it back. But they forgot to get the FAA's permission to bring it back. FAA didn't know or ask, like, are you bringing this back? Like, you're launching it, and are you bringing it back? Because a lot of satellites are launched, and you have to, there's a demise, there's a lifespan. Eventually, they have to come back, but not, like, within 4 or 5 days. So that helped the FAA clarify a rule to say, before you ask for permission to launch, you got to tell us when you need to bring it back. And so that was a good thing, right? There's no harm done. They all got happy ending.
I hope this isn't VARTA you're talking about.
I'm not getting to say who
Okay,
it is.
because VARTA, by the way, they did have permission from the FAA. It was from the federal range, so it was the coordination with DOD. So this was an interagency dispute that VARTA had, that actually FAA had with DOD to enter on the range. Just to point that out. It's slightly different, and I got to Jay's point about the jurisdictional friction, I think, that exists right now in the approval process. So they had to go to Australia.
Now VARTA and others are going to Australia for a variety of reasons, as you know, in part because there's even more land mass with no people, and also where you can land stuff without hitting anybody, but also it's more friendly for that kind of stuff.
So do agencies look at this as a vacuum that they want to fill?
I would say yes. I think it's a tendency to say this is kind of an unknown. We're a little worried, unspecified. This is the concerns, at least right now, in the proposal that Commerce has, that the administration has, for national security reasons, for foreign policy, for international obligations, and safety of operations. And a previous version had "and other interests." So it's a very broad look where the government just essentially wants to go, what exactly are you doing? And essentially put it through a black box interagency process that I would say has the chance of vetoing a business plan. But again, concerns that the specific criteria are not specified, I think would be the big thing that I see out of these proposals from the government saying we need to kind of have this look at what your business is.
I mean, we wrote an order that didn't claim a bunch of jurisdiction.
Right.
We tied back, here's the 4 areas we're going to look at, tie it to the statute. And frankly, that, I'd say, chipped off some areas that in the past the FCC had reviewed in licenses, and I think created some problems.
Yeah.
So on that, just to build, because this is not a space audience, this is very bright, these are very bright generalists here or experts in other areas. But just so folks know, like if you're a space entrepreneur, and I am looking at my notes because the list is long, you could have to deal with the FCC, the Department of Commerce in many ways. It could be NTIA itself, OSC, Office of Space Commerce, NOAA. Inside NOAA is CRISRA, which is the Commercial Remote Sensing Regulatory Affairs, should be authority, but anyway. And that's a big black box that deal with the intelligence agencies. And any imaging device that you launch, you have to get permission and classified through CRISRA. It's a very small staff, very opaque. We've had a lot of issues with them recently, like problems. DOD, or WART, DOW, FAA, maybe NASA. So one of our clients is Axiom, the world's hopefully first private sector space station. If VAST doesn't beat into the
It's funny
punch.
that the space agency is the one that's a maybe.
Well, but they're not a regulatory agency, right? They're great engineers and operators, but they're also not regulatory. But if you touch a NASA object, and Axiom a few years ago had another quick vignette. We had to work on this, was now like 5 years ago. We're sending private sector Axiom astronauts to the ISS because the Axiom is going to replace the ISS, but VAST is a competitor, which is all great too, so that's good. But they were bringing the same devices, the same actual units, like an iPod Nano, okay, so that government astronauts had just brought up to the ISS. And you have to shrink wrap, pack your suitcase, the payload, weeks ahead of time before the launch, right? So, so they did that, and then, but NASA said, wait a minute, you can't do that. We don't have a procedure for this. Like, no, sorry, it's the same exact device the government astronaut brought up, like the same one. But we don't have a procedure for that. And because it's a private sector astronaut, well, you've let the Russians in the ISS, you've let all sorts of people in the ISS with their stuff. Anyway, so now they have a process for it. So that's just one of many examples. So that was shuttle diplomacy, a lot of phone calls to get it done. There's not really a rule, but it's sort of like a understanding.
No, I think your point there, Rob, too, this is interesting. It's not really regulation, but since the government is the main customer for a lot of these companies, the government essentially can put conditions on their contracts, right? Yep. So in the case of regulation, it's not regulation per se, but the government is really saying do this. Yeah. So that's another element that really actually, Scott, when you were framing this discussion, I hadn't thought about, but yeah, that's absolutely true. You have the regulation of the industry, and then essentially what your main customer is asking you to do. We look at kind of, just as an example, remote sensing lately with Planet. The government asked them not to provide imagery to the media or NGOs about what's going on in Iran, and they complied. It's their main customer. Why wouldn't they? They're incented to do what the government asked them to do. So it's kind of another way that the government can get what it wants out of a company that's not regulation.
So Jim, when you actively decided that this was not something you should look at, which seems like, if it seems like the right approach, did that just open it up, though, to everybody else to say, well, then we're going to take it?
I think it, well, look, we granted the license, so it, I think, opens up, and this was for one experimental satellite.
Yeah.
And so I think that is going to facilitate, us all. There are a number of claims in the record about what wouldn't happen. So by having the experimental satellite up there, I think that can also help resolve this longer term. But no, look, we granted the license, and there might be people who think, hey, this is something that somebody should review, but for now, I don't think anybody is.
And why? That'd be my question. Not to.
Yeah, I mean, right? You have to go back to the algorithm of like.
Yeah. Why would you regulate that? It's beaming light to the Earth. Is that a safety issue? Is that the ants under a microscope, which is a funny scenario, but maybe that's a safety issue. I guess in my mind, though, like, what would we be regulating for?
I mean, our view is we're teeing up that question to be asked in a way.
Right. You guys didn't ask that question.
That it wasn't. We didn't ask.
Yeah, but legislators like to legislate. Litigators like to litigate, and regulators like to regulate, right? And so we're just talking about the U.S., by the way. Right. We haven't gotten to Europe. I know we will. Right, but sometimes regulators will, and sometimes this can fall on party lines, not to be partisan, let's regulate first, even though something hasn't happened, and that's kind of how Europe does things.
Is there a way, without talking about what happens when you open up the possibility of actual legislation, is there a way to say, or let's put it differently, what would you say should be off limits? Can you actively exclude things from government authority?
Well, it's sort of like the debate over AI, which is the U.S. versus the EU, let's say, which is let's see, yeah, that's right. Let's see how this evolves. We don't know how it's going to evolve. I mean, when I was at the commission from 2006 to 2013, well, first of all, I was sworn in the largest social networking site on June the 1st of 2006 was MySpace. All right. Twitter wasn't really a thing yet. I could have been the first commissioner on Twitter and Facebook. I decided not to for a variety of reasons, but those were all brand new. And you just don't know how things are going to evolve or what's coming over the horizon. So, that's my regulatory philosophy is don't regulate first and ask questions later, because you might be snuffing out a perfectly good idea that might not need regulation. But different political parties think differently, and different regions like Europe they think differently.
I would I'll just add that, like, if you can't identify a specific thing that shouldn't be regulated, I don't know if that means that you want a blanket review process. I mean, my take is, at least in the space community, and I'm a space geek, that's the community I'm from, there's this sense that there's this light touch regulatory authorizing approach to the government, but I don't really know what regulation is light touch. It's kind of like saying a light touch colonoscopy. I don't know what that means, but I think there's a lot of people in space who just thinks the government is going to say, they look at the proposal and they're like, that's great, stamp it, it's approved. Yeah. But that it implies to me that I think this question that we're asking, what are we really looking to do? We haven't really answered it, and I just don't think there's going to be an assumption that you'll pass every time, and that it's light touch at all.
So Shane Greenstein opened up the conference by talking about 1999, and that we didn't know what was going to happen then, and then you could go back and further to the Telecom Act of '96, and for all the problems it had. Basically, at the time, everyone was like, hands off the internet. Let's see what happens.
Right.
Is there anything sort of similar that could be done for space? I mean, we still did end up regulating all kinds of things, but there was a general view.
And we talked about this in our email exchange too, which is, so I was a baby lawyer back in the dot-com boom, bipartisan support, sort of hyper-libertarianism. Clinton-Gore administration, of course, everyone is in agreement, don't regulate it, but over time, it's a one-way ratchet for regulation, right? So things happen, or there are political constituencies, could be business constituencies that are looking for regulation for regulatory arbitrage or rent-seeking and things like that. So it'll happen here, and it's going to happen internationally, right? So the UN, there's a great paper by Jim Dunstan from a few years ago at Tech Freedom. Barron, where are you? Tell him I gave him a plug. Okay. I reread that. It was wonderful on the flight over here. But the UN, wants to grab a hold of a lot of space regulation, or all of it, for a variety of reasons. And when you read the patina on top of it, is it anti-U.S., is it anti-capitalist? There's some who say it's anti-colonialism. We shouldn't be talking about colonizing space. This is all in Jim's paper. So there will be more regulation there, but as a real macro matter, space is vast. We tend to think, as you said earlier, about SATCOM and kind of LEO or MEO, and stuff that's close to the Earth. But as you get farther away from the Earth, space is infinite, right? And do you really need regulation? Are we going to have U.S. regulation on Mars? Are we going to have it, outside the solar system? And there's plenty of spectrum out there, right? There's not a lot of spectrum congestion.
Space is vast is actually a quote from the Borg in Star Trek. Was that on purpose?
Maybe I've been absorbed. But I don't know. Hopefully not. Oh, geez. Very good. Very good. So anyway, it's, I again would say don't regulate and see how it all unfolds, and the farther away you get from Earth, the better. But there will be conflicts. There'll be international conflicts.
Yeah, I mean, to sort of second that and add to it a little bit, I'd say a lot of times, and I'll give you an example from Space World, a lot of times that inclination to sort of look out there and say, oh, I can kind of see this problem, or this resources becoming more limited, and then to immediately jump to, I know the right regulation right now, I think can be a real problem. Because what we often will see is we often see that we as societies figure it out. The private sector actors figure it out in ways. And so the example, the analogy that I've often used is 1920. You look at all of these automobiles that are starting to flood our communities, right? And look what it's scaring the horses, and gosh, this is crowded. And maybe in 1920 there was 1 million cars in the United States, right? 1 million cars, wow, that's a lot of cars, right? And if we would have said, hey, we're going to cap it right now, like we'll do 1.5 million, right? That's all the cars the United States can handle. That would have been really myopic. Right? Because what we learned is that we did have to, in some cases, make rules of the road, but we did a lot of things that actually enabled, 300 million cars or 400, however many we have, right? And all of the benefits and trucking and everything that you get from that. And so I think, completely agreeing with Rob, if we sit here and we say, oh yeah, we know the right regulation right now, that's a big problem. So, space, the sort of car avoiding everybody analogy, I think works pretty well, is that there's a lot of private sector activity to avoid conjunctions, right? And so I think if you can figure out how can we use technologies, collision avoidance and the SSA, space situational awareness systems, which those are being provided by the private sector. There's some public sector provision of that, and have common sense rules of the road, which may even not even require regulation at this point, we might find that, hey, we can actually have a lot more beneficial space activity well before we've gotten to some constraint on the amount of space or the amount of spectrum
This
that's
is
out
the
there.
second amazing 1920s car analogy you've given me personally.
Oh, did I give you another one?
You've done another one.
I'm like one trick pony, yeah.
No,
But like it's
two
just
tricks with one pony.
like we as societies in these sort of technological transitions so often figure out ways to work through the problems
Yeah, no, it's-
without direct regulation, and it's a real mistake to do it too early.
To build on what he's saying too, which is for those who don't know, so coordination spectrum, there's not as much spectrum available for space as there is terrestrial. There just isn't. So, but you also don't need it to be always on. It can be very bursty. So coordination is a big part of space regulation. Without that being regulation, it could be a condition of a license, and that maybe is regulatory, to your earlier point, but it's not a rule necessarily, right? So the parties work it out. And so maybe that's a model going forward, especially the farther away you get from the Earth.
Yeah, I mean, without going into too much of the details, one of the things that we focused on the last 18 months is, are there other ways we can essentially let private market transactions on spectrum as well sort of solve those problems? So rather than us having a command and control view of deciding it's just you that gets it or just you that gets it. You can create situations where you might have a regulatory backstop, but then allow better outcomes through private market transactions.
And speaking of command and control, WRC is coming up, and there's a lot of space on the agenda. That seems like a huge threat, right? I mean, is this going to create a bunch of new rules that are going to hurt the space economy? Because can't think of a time that the ITU, everyone got together to make the world better for markets.
I mean, I think it's a concerted effort to, I think we've said this a few times yesterday and today, to hold the U.S. back. I mean, the U.S. is the clear leader in the space economy. The U.S. companies are dominant, really one right now. Everyone wants to be the next SpaceX. Dominating launch, dominating broadband, going to dominate data centers in space, dominating human space flight. All these areas are where U.S. companies are in the lead. On the moon, if there's one area where everyone looks at us and wants to be like us, I think it's space right now, and I think the ITU agenda reflects that. So really, I see this as a tool that a lot of other countries, including China right now, who wants to do a lot of these same things, but in the interim, they're happy to hold us back. They're going to hold us back while they get their act together, and I think they're going to use processes like the ITU to do that. I don't really see it in our benefit how it stacks so much against space at the ITU.
Are you allowed to comment, Jay?
I'm not sure I have much to add.
This is the Fifth Amendment, so yeah, so you're absolutely right. The ITU, so just so folks know, International Telecommunication Union, and under the auspices of the UN, as David Gross taught me to say 20 years ago. It was formed in the mid-19th century, effectively for telegraph payments across borders and things like that. And has since morphed and evolved, and we've had to beat back several attempts for them to get into internet governance, like with the WIC at 12. And thank you, David, for all of your help helping me look smarter than I am during that time. Yes, so you have the client states, it's political, one vote, one country, one vote, just so folks know. For example, I was trying to get the Vatican to show up to the WIC because they have the same vote as China. They don't really like China, and I succeeded. It was kind of cool. Anyway, so
You got a dispensation for that.
Maybe, yes. Being Catholic, it's not quite an indulgence, but close enough. Yes, you have the client states of Russia and China. You have all of Africa kind of locked up, and a lot of the Mideast, and a lot of folks who don't like us very much. And it's one country, one vote. So it can be tricky. I will let true experts like a David Gross comment further on it. But the U.S. has to be very smart about it. David gave a very eloquent description of Adam Cassidy, the incoming newly sworn-in ambassador, and he's going to do a terrific job. He's a friend of mine as well. He's going to be a bulldozer, so don't second guess what the United States is going to be able to accomplish at the Work 27. But no, it's in those multilateral international bodies. It's tough, and you're absolutely right. And even Europe isn't our friend, right? So they have their EU Space Act, which is designed to make Europe more robust and to try to catch up to us. And you have countries like Luxembourg who want to be the Delaware of space. They are the Delaware of space, they say.
Maybe they could be
So.
the Vatican of space.
That's right. Well, I think the Vatican will be the Vatican of space, but yes, that's the much bigger picture. What goes, what they think about the Vatican. But yeah, it's to answer your question. The U.S. has a lot of challenges if we want to stay number one in this race.
We should probably take some questions before we run out of time. Anybody have any questions? If not, I've got more. Yeah. The microphone is coming. But, yeah.
This is probably going to sound like a leftist ode to regulation, but I actually really believe it. If you combine broad scope with humility and light touch, I actually think you get to a better place from a market perspective, right? If you're going out trying to raise money from investors and convince people around the world that your business plan has legs, you probably want a license that doesn't just tell you or tell the world my use of RF is kosher. If you have a license that says the government has sort of considered the novelty of what I'm trying to do and has decided to say yes after that review, that is a very valuable piece of paper. And I think with the ITU, it's the same thing, right? So if we think about right now, putting the work aside, the companies that probably have the most to gain from the ITU filing priority system, they're probably two very large US companies, right? Without that framework, they're gonna have a much harder time, exporting their business plan and building the scale they need. So, I very much appreciate streamlining, light touch regulation, and humility, especially at the beginning of an emerging technology era, as we're seeing in space. But I don't think that necessarily means, foot off the gas entirely or narrowing scope so much that, important or issues that people think are important go entirely without consideration and review.
Anybody comment?
So at the beginning you said breadth but light touch. So I'm, lots packed in there. Breadth of jurisdiction but light touch is ephemeral. And you tend to have only one-way ratchet with regulation, that it gets more regulatory over time, whether that's a good idea or not, whether you need it or not. And so back to the earlier comment about 1999 and the hyper-libertarian internet, well, it's pretty well regulated now. Certainty, I think, is also maybe kind of buried in what you just said. So everybody wants certainty, right? And you want stability. And so if you mean light touch and that's going to be the state of affairs for a long time and hopefully forever, great, then yes, investors can invest based on that. But if it's breadth and light touch and that changes by after elections or elsewhere in the globe, then that creates uncertainty and that starts to choke off investment capital.
I guess one last thing. Rob, you've talked about the idea of a one-stop shop. Or at least your clients would like a one-stop shop. But, does that potentially cause additional problems? I mean, DHS was a one-stop shop, right? And, did that solve the problems it was supposed to?
Yeah.
Not that that's a leading question or anything.
Right. And one-stop shopping, it'll never happen. I'm just talking about the U.S. here. So if you're an entrepreneur, can you go to one window to get all your government licensing and needs? No, that's never, ever going to happen. And that's never going to happen because Congress will not pass a comprehensive piece of legislation that says that or does that. Why? Because all sorts of committees have jurisdiction over NOAA versus NASA versus FCC, et cetera, right? Or DOD or wherever, right? So there are all these different committees, and that's going to be really hard to effectuate. But it would be nice if each of those offices, each of those agencies could take a page from the J. Schwarz reformation of the Space Bureau, which is a new bureau, and make it more consumer friendly and have shot clocks and transparency and responsiveness. And he's done that. He changed the culture in an office that folks said that could never be done, and he did it in a very short period of time. So it's possible, but we're not going to see comprehensive legislation. You'll see rifle shot legislation here and there, but not what I'm dreaming of. So.
Jay, there used to be this, maybe there still is this tradition of presidents leaving a little note to their successor in the desk. Maybe now it's just, a screed in all caps with exclamation points. But what secret note would you leave to your successor? And we won't tell anybody.
Thick skin.
Yeah, I think the point I made earlier would be, some good advice. People talk about we want to have a default to yes. I've said that many times, but then maybe the advice is how do you operationalize that? So I think a lot of what I did early on at the Space Bureau was thinking about, okay, how do you actually try to make a process work better? We say we want to default to yes. That doesn't mean a guaranteed yes, by the way. That's, we want to default to yes. So how do you operationalize that? And I think it is, focusing on the specific things where there are harms, and you have, a statutory obligation to review it, and focus on those things. And what that does is if you tell everybody that's what we're going to focus on, then you don't end up on these rabbit trails, which I think maybe was common at the Space Bureau in the past, or the IB and the International Bureau in the past, where you might end up on some rabbit trails that just lead to unpredictability for the applicant, probably takes a lot longer. And if you do that, then people will know what you're going to do. You can enforce timelines and shot clocks. And then again, I feel fairly strongly that if there is some other harm that somebody that needs to be addressed, that shines a light on it, and Congress can consider it.
Okay. All right, well, I think we should leave it there. So thank you all so much. Please join me in giving them a hand. So that is the end of TPI Aspen 2026. Thank you all for coming and for staying till the bitter end. And I just want to make sure that everybody knows we need to thank Jane Creel, especially, who makes everything happen. Like I said before, that's true. It'll always remain true. And all of the other TPI staff who made sure everything ran so smoothly. So, thank Jane on the way out, because she did more for everyone here than you possibly know. So thank you all very much, and we'll see you again soon.
All right. Thank you,
Mr.
President. Yes, sir.
Finish the dessert.
Yeah, I got to finish my dessert. I was afraid we were going to take it away.